microphone on. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of things, from how I handle the emotional toll to tools and techniques to community management when you're ridiculously late, as I am. And I'll be available to answer questions. Can you hear me now? Okay, cool. Yeah, great. I'll be available to answer questions after the presentation, and I'll try and keep an eye on the chat as much as I can while I'm going through this. So I wanted to sort of show the game real quick. So this is my game, XO. In XO, you're the admiral of a fleet running from an enemy that you cannot defeat. And as you jump from planet to planet, you encounter different starships. And what you decide to do with these ships is up to you. You can hail them and interact with them through a choose your own adventure story like this. Or you can send in boarding parties and try and take the ship by force, or loot their cargo, or force the crew to serve you, or salvage the ship for resources. There's a lot of things you can do. And each ship that you bring into your fleet increases your chances of survival, but also uses precious resources. So because of that, it's not possible to save everyone, and you have to decide who survives. And all of these choices that you make influence the relationships that you have with 4 other factions in the game, which in turn changes what happens during your run. And maybe not everybody will agree, but I consider the game to be a roguelike, because we have permadeath and procedural encounters, and primarily because the experience is designed around learning from failure. So it's quite hard. And you might have guessed that I've watched a lot of Battlestar Galactica, played a lot of FTL, and for sure those things were huge influences. But I also sponged up tons of other sci-fi and read a bunch of historical naval accounts and even historical fiction, and basically anything else that I could watch, read, or listen to for the last 6.5 years. But I also used my experiences running a small business and dealing with kind of the chaos and unpredictability that's inherent in that kind of lifestyle as the basis for the game. So we're in Steam Early Access now, and so without further ado, hopefully this will come back, my presentation, come back. So I want to talk about the different, here we go, the different things that I experienced playing, oops, went a few forward, here we go. All right, so the first thing that I want to talk about is, and if you take nothing else from this presentation, take this. Show your game as much as possible, as early as possible. And it's not so much for marketing, although that does sort of help. It's to uncover problems in the game. And for me, personally, I need fresh eyes to uncover problems in the game. And I think that's primarily because I'm the one who's designed the feature, and I know exactly what it is that I'm looking for and how it should be used. And for sure, my job is to try and impart that knowledge to new players, but the only way to be sure is to try it on fresh eyes. So we started showing the game super early on, and we continually show it. And I feel like showing it to potential customers is very high value. Other game developers, friends, or worst case, people who aren't even going to buy your game but might just be gamers, are not going to be a really good fit. Partly because it's very hard to get really good, authentic advice, like the hard advice you need to hear, the harsh criticism you need to hear from people who are your friends. But also because a lot of criticism is unspoken, and you kind of only get it by watching someone play or not understand it. And I also want to say that the very highest value that I get from watching other people play is from streamers. And I think this is because streamers, when they play a game, they've sort of taught themselves to verbalize everything that's going on in their mind, whereas lots of players, they don't necessarily talk as they play, and you sort of have to figure out what's going on in their head. The streamer will tell you exactly what's going on in their mind, and it's just priceless information. So with that in mind, what do you do when you get the criticism, right? Because the reality is, at some point, you are almost certain to receive negative feedback on your game. And certainly for me, this can bring up all kinds of emotions and reactions. And, I come into showing the game to somebody just really pumped up, I get all psyched because I've worked really hard and lots of love has gone into what I'm doing. So I'm really deeply emotionally invested in the game at that part. And I don't know, I feel like I'm not alone in this. I think a lot of fellow game developers are like this. Like, I have this deep-seated need to create and to please and to be seen as good at what I do. And maybe you're like this also. And so, when I receive criticism, it's sometimes hard not to take it personally. So here's my number one strategy for dealing with this, with tough criticism. And it's that criticism is actually a huge compliment. And it's sort of counterintuitive, but really when someone takes the time to give you negative feedback, it's almost the best thing you can ask for, really. And, the other sort of part to this is, you may have noticed that gamers are fairly passionate, and we often don't filter what we say. So sometimes that can come across as being hurtful, but if you put a different filter on it, like, they're really trying to tell me something, and thank you, I'm honored that you've taken the time to do that. It really makes a difference. I think, at least for me, my emotional state when I receive that feedback. So, the other thing to consider there is the alternative, which is silence. Nobody saying anything is much worse. I'd much rather have bad criticism than no criticism at all. So, the takeaway from that, I think, is failure is a good thing. Hopefully now I've got my emotions managed, and now how do we manage the actual feedback, particularly the critical feedback, which you're going to get lots of. First of all, some feedback just isn't going to map to your vision of the product. Like, I'm not going to make XO multiplayer. It's just not going to happen. Some feedback is going to be just way too ambitious for the scope of what you're going to do. So I keep it, but I put it further down in the stack. And the second thing I do is I keep all the feedback in one place. And I keep it all in one place because I need to come back to it. Sometimes in the moment when I read the criticism, it's just a little too much to take, and I'm not in the right place to sort of evaluate it and take it in. Sometimes it takes me longer. And this is the way I am, but sometimes I need time to accept a truth about my game that I don't agree with. So by keeping all the feedback in one place and coming back regularly and looking at it, I can say, you know what, that's really right. And getting more, when you start hearing the same thing, more than a couple of times, it starts to become a trend, and it's something that I feel like is worthy of paying attention to. And you can do things like, for example, on our Discord, we have, like many other games do, we have a bot that allows you to suggest features and vote on them. You can vote up or vote down on them. And that really helps me understand where the game is needing maybe to go, or what people are really wanting in the game. So moving on from that, as you're working on the game, and certainly as I worked on XO, I didn't have a shortage of ideas. And the chances are you also will not be short on ideas as you design your game. And the more you develop it, probably the more ideas you're going to get. So I want to talk about this idea of agility and agile, and there's a bunch of different flavors of agile software development, but I just want to boil it down to a concept that I think is really meaningful in game development, and that's this admission that you're never going to have enough time, you're never going to have enough money, you're never going to have enough people to finish everything that you want on your game. So let's just admit that right up front and design our development philosophy around just dealing with that. And I have a long history in doing software development, even outside of game development. I've done dozens and dozens of projects, and some of them quite large. And from these experiences, I've come to realize that this sort of agile mentality is really useful. So what we do instead is we work on very short bursts. On XO, they're like daily bursts. And every day I'm deciding what's the next most important thing to do. And we just go until, we're done. And it's kind of like this active, ongoing triage at a hospital that's overwhelmed with patients. And you just have to choose what's important. And, to be honest, this idea is reflected in the core game loop of XO. It's sort of like a fundamental thing that you can't do everything at once. So it's really helped us in the game, and it's certainly helped me. I have too many ideas, so it definitely helps me to focus on what's important. So I also want to talk a little bit about innovation, about like doing new things. And if you take a minute to read the title of this slide, I think it's worthy, because I actually dictated that line into my iPad, and I actually have no idea what I was trying to say. And it also looks like Siri had no idea what I was trying to say either. And the point of this, really, why I left this in is because voice recognition as a piece of software, it's a perfect example of something that, like game development, already sounds hard, right? But it's actually much, much harder than it sounds the more you look at it. And my experience with trying to do new things, particularly in game development, has been like that too. It's sort of like this iceberg thing. You can look at it and go, oh, you know what, that looks like it's going to be hard. But then the deeper you go into it, it ends up being just this massive, massive thing. So I want to talk about some stuff that I've learned along the way about that. And first of all, innovation, it's arguably necessary to be successful. There's plenty of examples of games that aren't like super, super innovative and have done well. But if you're pursuing innovation, it can be super expensive. And, it's doing anything new, right? It's going to take longer because it hasn't been tried before. But also, you might realize that it has been tried before and you just didn't know it, which is, failures aren't publicized as much as successes, which makes innovation harder the harder we go into game development. So these days, when we're about to embark on something slightly innovative or different, I brace myself for the reality that things that sound great on paper might take an enormous amount of time. And then once you do them, there's a really good chance that they're not even going to work out. And you might have to just start from scratch. And it's that sort of trial and error process that can end up taking an enormous amount of time. And it can also be super frustrating as well. So here's what I do to minimize that risk. First of all, I have a core group of really trusted advisors. And these are people that have been there and they've done that. Like me, they've released games, or they've spent just a long time in their field, whether it's software development or user interface or animation or stuff like that. These are the people that I go to and I chat with them. Hey, I have this idea, and they can help by saying, oh yeah, I tried that back and da-da-da-da, and here's the things that I found, or here's what you might want to watch out for, things like that. It's super useful. Paper prototypes are something that, to be honest, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming to see the value of. And they're basically just making simple paper, like board games of your game and using the paper pieces to sort of play out your game. And it's very cheap and it's very fast, and it did help in several ways on the road to making XO. Something that I do a lot of when I'm trying something new is time boxing. And time boxing is just saying, I've got 2 hours to do this animation. And I've never done an animation like this, but I'm just going to try it. And at the end of that time, if I haven't done a good enough job on it, or I'm not feeling like it's good enough, I can feel better about chucking it and moving on, because it's been a relatively small burst of time, and I don't get sucked into this enormous kind of thing where you're just working on something and not pulling it, not feeling like it can be done. So the last thing that we've done right, I think, in the project is go after the minimum viable feature, which is the smallest amount of development that you can possibly do to get the concept across. And a great example of this is our event system, which is super complex, but it didn't start out that way. It started out that way just with like the barest minimum thing. Okay, what happens when a new ship appears? Well, you can hail it and it'll say something. That's it. And now it's evolved. We've just kept adding on to it. Now it's just this enormous like scripting system. But it had to prove itself in the beginning, and we tried several other ways of going about it, and this is the one that totally stuck. So I'm really glad that we're doing minimum viable feature these days. And last thing I want to say is, at the end of the day, you can try all these things, but you're really only going to truly know once you actually develop out the feature and get it out in front of people. And there have been plenty of times where we've done that, and it hasn't really been as successful as we've hoped, and that's painful and expensive. So next thing I want to talk about is something called software tests. And when I talk about software tests, I'm not talking about play testing or like bug testing, which certainly I do an enormous amount of. Probably at least 30% of my time is play testing and testing the game. But I'm talking about test-driven development, or TDD, which means you write software to test your software. So for example, if you've got a ship that's got armor, you need to test that the laser hits the ship and takes away armor. So by having a software test, it means that you don't have to go in and load a ship and then have it fire and observe, oh yeah, it hit. And it really speeds up the development process. And it, because nobody likes testing. Testing is really hard and exhausting, and it can be really hard on your emotional state in a small group. So anything you can do to mitigate this will really help. And some things in games are quite hard to write tests for, but that also means that they're probably going to be hard-ish to develop for. So it's important to, sort of think, well, how many times realistically am I going to have to test this feature, right? Probably hundreds of times. So spending a little bit of time writing a software test really pays for itself. So think about that. All right, moving on to estimating. I feel like there's a real good reason why a lot of developers say our game will be ready when it's ready. And I have a lot of background in estimating. Before I worked on XO, I had a software development company, and we were building out open source things for clients. And it was kind of life or death for the company that we'd be able to estimate how much time it would take us to do a project. Otherwise, it would be over for us, right? So I'm not going to talk an enormous amount about estimating. If people have questions about estimating or whatever, I can talk maybe a little bit after the talk about it. But there can often be pressure on you by your player base to come back with when is this going to be done? Or you can put pressure on yourself. You may say, I really need to know when this game is done. And there's some problems with that. And one of the things, and I'm talking strictly about software development in this regard, there's sort of a truth in software estimation, and that's it can take up to 80% of the time that you need to actually do the work to estimate it. Meaning, if you're doing software development right, most of that work is done in your head. You're thinking about how you're going to approach it and how it's going to interface with the rest of the system and how you can do it in an elegant way and how you're going to maintain it and things like that. And after all that, the actual writing of the code is relatively short. So it's a problem because, if you have somebody spend all that time thinking it through, and then they're going to do that work months from now, they're going to forget all of that. So you're wasting your time. And, for sure, that's why I don't estimate anymore. Once you've started work with your team, something that's useful to look at is what's called cadence, which is really just a measure of what you've done in the past. Now we use Trello, which is like a card-based system. And so when a task gets done, it gets dragged over into being completed. So I can see, our cadence is this many cards per day. And that gives me a fuzzy look into the future. And it gives me kind of a very, like Vaseline on a window glance at how long this might take. But this hangs on your ability to be able to break those tasks up into roughly the same size buckets, which is quite a skill. And, even then it's going to be hazy because there's other system effects that might affect it. But I feel like cadence is a better way of estimating than actually estimating. So I want to talk about user interface. User interface has been really hard, partly because I personally was really bad at UI when I started XO. And I made some really awful mistakes. So one of the mistakes I made is I asked people who didn't have experience in user interface to mock up user interface. And, these are like really talented people, great developers, but I kind of violated my core rule of taking advice, which is don't ask someone for advice unless they've actually already done it. Whether or not they failed, it doesn't matter. Yeah, that was a bad idea. For me personally, I struggled with this desire to want to think out of the box, and I failed so brutally and so crushingly. Man, that was a waste of time. I had this idea that I wanted to make the contextual actions, which in the game are flat now, and make more sense. I wanted to make them 3D because the game is 3D. So I had this idea of this sort of hedron, like this polygonal object that you would rotate and see the things. We spent so much time on it. It was just a terrible idea. I should never have done it in the first place. Anybody who knows anything about user interface would have told me that is just a stupid idea. Fortunately, a while back, I came to my senses and I got real help from a dear friend of mine, Randall Hansen, who's a UI master, and he really helped drag the game into a decent place with a user interface. And even all of that said, it has been such an enormous undertaking to pull the UI together for this game. It's just, I don't know, maybe 30% of the entire development lifecycle has been on user interface. It's been a lot, maybe more, really, when you think about it, because it's such an all-encompassing thing. All right, so moving on from that, we did a couple of things that I would not advise doing on a longer project, which is switching and upgrading tools. We, for quite a while in the beginning, Unity, which is our game engine, would do an update, and we would upgrade, and it would break things, and it would end up taking us like a week of development time. And that's really expensive. And looking back, I really don't think the value is there. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. We switched some other things. So I chose a project management software that I really didn't like after a ways into the project. Then we moved to Trello, which I really do like. But the pain of that is we lost the ability to sort of look at some of the earlier history of the project, and that's painful. And it took time to transfer and adjust. And we also switched version control software, which was a total mistake, and it was hugely painful. It made it harder for us to find older code. It made us, lose time, and it was just not worthwhile. We're using Git. We used Git, and then we changed to another version control software that had just different problems. Like Git's got problems, but they all have problems. So we switched back to Git finally. And I really like Git. I mean, it allows you to do things, and we use it all the time. Like, if you're not using version control software, you need to use version control software. Like, it saves our lives. We have different branches that we're working in. We've got a master branch that contains the actual code for what's live on Steam, and we have a development branch for what is being worked on in the next version. And then we have these other branches, like right now we're working on sectors, and I can go and test what's going on in the sectors branch without breaking anything in the development branch. And when I'm done with that, I go back to the development branch and I keep adding the events that I'm doing. And it's really beautiful. And at the end of the day, when sectors is ready, we just merge the two together and we're all good to go. So it's night and day helpful, particularly working with more than one person. But even if not, you have to be using version control software. So another thing I want to talk about is naming conventions, which is just a set of rules you use to name variables the same way every single time. And in our game, there's over 10,000 lines of dialogue, and the scripted events, which is what you see on the right, there's over 225,000 lines of that in the game. So having consistency means that I can do searching and replacing super easy. It means I can sort really easily. I have a script that I run that checks the logic of all of these things and alerts me if for some reason I've missed a tag or the tag got deleted or something like that, and checks that events don't have conflicting conditions and things like that. It's really nice. And it also enables me to replicate really easily, because I can just cut and paste, make a couple of small changes, everything works great. And then the last thing is it allows for the software to randomize. So if you see the highlighted line up there, it says the rundown, that _001 is one of, I think, 6 of these type events, and the game will just randomly pick one of them. So you get replayability a lot quicker and easier with this. And we also do that with dialogue. So any dialogue line has like this 001, 002 or whatever, and the game will just randomly pick one of those things. And it just helps make the game feel a little bit more alive. And it's kind of something you get for free with good naming conventions. So another thing that was a huge win for us was using open source and free tools. And sometimes there can be a little bit of elitism or something like that, particularly around like 3D tools. I've heard sometimes, you're not using Maya, or whatever. But, honestly, for what we were doing, Blender was a phenomenal tool for 3D. I've used it for all of the 3D models, all of the animations, all the 3D models that I did, which is about half in the game, and all of the animations. And it's been super useful, like a great piece of software. LibreOffice, which I use for writing all the events, has been really great. Google Docs for collaboration. And in particular, I want to call out Vim, which is a text editor that I could not have done without in this project. There's just no way. So it's an incredibly powerful text editor. And I'll just give you one example. There are many, but one example is you can cut and paste into multiple registers, meaning you can have multiple cut and pastes, and then you can use a macro and push those cut and pastes, those different cut and pastes in based on how you structure your macro, which it's a lot of power. It's so awesome. It also does syntax highlighting, which is what you see on the right. Like, Vim does this. I just put in some really simple rules, and it makes the log files so much easier for me to read because I spent a lot of time looking at the log files doing testing. So it's really fantastic. I think I talked about shell scripts before. They're super powerful, and regex is built into Vim, which is amazing. So yeah, check that stuff out. So for the last part of the talk, I want to talk about community management. I've got a few things to say about this because we've been late. So our Kickstarter was funded in 2015, and I promised a delivery date of spring of 2016, which, yeah, we missed that by a fair amount. I will say that in our defense, we did deliver alpha keys to all of our backers in mid-2019, and the game has been playable since mid-2019. And since we released into alpha, we've released over 40 updates, and some of them have been really, really large since then. And we've been in early access for like a year and a half now. So yeah, I mean, in terms of like delivering the game to our Kickstarter backers, like we for sure delivered more than we said we would deliver, but the game still isn't done, and that's the reality. So I want to talk about some of this. So you find yourself late, like we did. I think the first and most important thing is you really don't want to beat yourself up about this. This is, it's not an excuse by any means, but a lot of games are late, and a lot of software development is late. Maybe not as late as my game, but it does happen a lot. And it definitely does not help you to sort of beat up on yourself, which I did a lot of early on until I just realized, you know what, I'm not helping the game, so I need to just move past the emotions of feeling like I failed, or actually the emotions of failing, and move on to how can I deliver this? How can I make this? How can I make this work? And sort of claw back that lost trust that you have with your backers or your community. So the first thing is I made a decision to publish an enormous amount of progress on the game at regular intervals. So the first part of it is that progress, when you show it, it speaks for yourself. Now, it doesn't matter how hard you work if you're not showing it to your community. And I've seen that sometimes in other contemporary projects that sort of started around the same time as ours. And I know that they were working on it, but because they didn't show it, they didn't maybe get a little bit, they didn't get the recognition that they deserved, or at least the reduction of nastiness. So I ended up spending about, a minimum of 2, sometimes 3 or more days per month. And if you figure a month has got about 20 working days in it, it's definitely more than 10, maybe sometimes 15, sometimes 20% of my total time just writing these updates. And maybe I spent too much time on them, but maybe they were too detailed. But I really feel like the progress that I showed was absolutely undeniable, and that really made a difference, I feel like, with the community. The other thing that I did was I posted regularly, and I was pretty diligent about making regular posts. And what this does is every time that you say you're going to post and then you post it, it at least proves that you're serious about keeping a schedule, and you're establishing trust with kind of every post that you make. And the other thing I think that's really important about this is that it gives your community something to talk about instead of speculating in a vacuum. Because I think we all know that speculating in a vacuum is often going to be really negative, and we really want to avoid that. So post frequently. I've read from other projects that have been late some really heartbreaking devlogs that have been negative, and some of them have gone so far as to like berate their community or say nasty things like that. And I feel the pain, and I know the hurt that leads to those kind of feelings. But sharing that kind of negative energy with your community is just absolute poison. You have to stay positive, and you have to let your passion for your project shine when you're giving out your updates. And go back to your trusted advisors, talk to other game developers who have walked where you have walked most likely and can be the most sympathetic for you. I've always been positive and enthusiastic, just like I really am with the game. So yeah. So another thing that I think happens, and has happened to all of us, so we probably already, all of us have probably seen this, like when somebody asks a public question on a forum, it can be really hard to tell if that person is legitimately curious or they're being sarcastic or maybe even mean. So my place has always been first to remind myself that anybody writing anything, they're doing me an honor by taking their valuable time and saying something. And for that reason alone, they deserve a reply, I feel like. And the second part is just to assume that they really are just being curious and interested. No matter what they say, get the root of what they're talking about and just respond to it. And sometimes the questions can be really hard to answer. So particularly when it has to do with things that you look, game development is hard. We all know game development is really hard. And it's also, how many times have we heard this? It's really hard for people who aren't in game development to understand what we're doing. It's really hard. It's hard to understand how hard it is. Sometimes it can be helpful to explain some aspects of why you're not doing what you're doing. So for example, I've had multiple times people ask fairly aggressively to promise a delivery date for EXO. And, I would say, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to make any promises that I'm going to break and all that. And, it would be sort of like a regular thing. Like that would not be enough of an answer. They would come back, no, there must be some way that you can do that. So I did take the time a couple of times to explain what I explained about estimating, and that it would actually take longer. It would make the game take longer. It would take longer to get into their hands to play, and it might not even be accurate anyway. So, I was pretty firm about it. I held my place, but I was very polite about it as well. And I feel like that really did help. And, in a way, it's like all they wanted really was to be heard, Moving on, once I missed my that 2016 delivery date, I promised myself not to make any more promises that I couldn't absolutely fulfill. And I said that many times, and I think it helped. And when it came up, about the 26th delivery date, I never sidestepped it. I was like, yep, I'm late. I'm sorry about it. I'm moving on. And I think it's important to own it. And just, what else can you do? I feel like that worked very well for us. I've seen other projects make promises, and yeah, I feel like they got short-term relief and they built a little excitement, but when they didn't deliver, now you've broken trust twice, and it becomes really hard to regain that, and people can turn against you, and you just like don't want that happening. So what I kind of end up saying is I present it as a choice to people. So like I could release now, but it wouldn't be good. Or I could keep working on it until it's great. And I feel like that has always worked. People are always going to want to say yes, because let's face it, we're not delivering vaccines here. We're making games. So people really, they just want to know that you haven't given up. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have for this. I'm gonna try and get my streaming thing up there. Yeah, yeah. So if there are any questions, I'm going to review the chat. But if you got any questions, fire them out to me, and I'll do my best to answer them. Yeah. Hey, thanks for the great comments, people. It's really nice to hear your good stuff. Yeah. So, yeah, I definitely want to give a talk about my experience running a Kickstarter. That's like its own talk, I really feel like. And there's a lot that I have to say about Kickstarter. Some of it may not be relevant because it was so long ago, but I think some of it for sure is. I definitely want to talk about those kind of things. So yeah, thanks for the compliments on the beard. It's like, it's gotten freaking gantic. It's, yeah. Got to make a beard going on these days. I think I'm gonna cut it for summer though. I think I might just do that. I'm not sure that there are any actual questions out there. If there aren't any questions in chat, I'm probably gonna wrap it all up. Oh yeah, okay, so here's a question. How do you this is from Helm Systems. How do you handle estimates internally with your team? Do you find that they help? I used to do that, and to some degree, we still do. So for example, right now we're about 80% through with adding sectors to the game, which are smaller jump areas. Instead of one big giant globe, they're now going to be smaller jump areas, and there's some assorted functionality around that. But going into it, I needed to know, was this going to be too much? Was this going to be like a crazy amount of work? And so we spent time talking through it, and Harry, who's our developer, who's phenomenal, went back and he spent a little bit of time thinking about it, not necessarily doing a formal estimate like it's going to take me X number of hours, but coming back and saying, there's a possibility that we can crash and burn here, but I think we can get this minimum viable sectors up and see. And that was enough for me. So yeah, we kind of don't do anything more detailed than that, than spending maybe 5 or 10 minutes talking about it. So yeah, we spent a lot more time. We spent a lot more time up front when we were planning the Kickstarter, particularly when we put out all of the stretch goals. We spent a lot of time estimating for those, because I feel like Kickstarter stretch goals are a possibility where you can get really deeply in trouble if you underestimate them, and you find now that you're under a promise to deliver some enormous bunch of functionality. So that is for sure a place that I would do estimates. If you're working with a publisher, it's very likely that they're going to insist on estimates. If they're giving you money, they're going to be wanting estimates, and they're going to want to know that you understand how to estimate, and they're going to hold you to them, or at least budget it such that you're going to feel the squeeze in that regard. So yeah, I guess that's my answer there. Yeah. Any other questions out there? Yeah, no, it's fine. So yeah, how do you handle project milestones is another question. So what I do is I use the cadence of the past, which is X number of stories that have been completed in Trello per day, and I look at it in the future and say, all right, well, I'd like to release the next version by, say, April 30th. And then I'll count up how many stories I think I can do, sort them into what I think is most important, and put the number that I think is fair for our cadence into that. And I have a little tag, a little story that says, here's the 141 milestone. In practice, what happens is bugs will come up and we'll have to spend time doing that. We might get feedback or something that bumps something higher up into the priority list. So the things that we do that I thought I was going to do for 141, for example, might change over time. So I'll move those out. And as the date gets closer, sometimes I get to do more things. Sometimes I get to do more stories in there. More often than not, I have to pull things out. But I tend to stick to the dates rather than bits of functionality for the milestone, because I feel like in early access, it's really important to be having regular updates. When you don't do regular updates, people feel like the project is dead and you can be working your heart out. And again, it's the same thing that I talked about before. So there's only been a couple of instances where I've held back the game longer, and that's when we've worked on functionality and it just hasn't been ready. Like we had this big, 140 was a good example of that. It took like an extra month to do because I wanted to get the jump sequence down really well, and it touched a lot of things in the game. So yeah, I hope that's a reasonable answer for how we handle milestones. Yeah, cool. All right, cool. Well, unless there are any other questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm also on the Discord and IWOCon on the Indie World Order channel. Thanks a bunch for joining me on this, and yeah, good luck with your game.